Hey, this is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie, and today I just want to talk about something that's really important to me, and that's walking. I think walking is one of the most important things you can do for yourself, and it's not important simply because it's so conducive to so many other things, in the sense that not only does it make you more fit, given that it's a low impact exercise, and given that it releases all kinds of chemicals that are beneficial not only in the immediate moment but in the long term. It has to do with the simple pleasure of walking. You know, walking to me is a activity that's sort of related to reading, in the sense that both are not helpful as a means to something in themselves, even though it is. It's also helpful in the sense that it helps you ultimately circulate within yourself, because walking is largely circular. You're usually starting somewhere and ending up somewhere else, and in many ways this motion, this bipedalism, sort of allows you to start thinking and start expanding in ways that you otherwise might not be sensitive to. And so there's a sense in which, even as I speak right now, I'm sort of warming up, quote unquote. That the brain is something that has to be helped to the degree to which we can help it. What I mean to say is that each of us finds certain rituals or certain activities that help us discover that state of mind where we don't feel necessarily a negative feeling, and it's not necessarily a positive feeling, but there's a sense in which you have to use two hands to hold the fragile egg that consciousness is. And so I think walking is one of those activities that ultimately, for whatever reason, seems to strengthen my own sensitivity to the richness of life. And I think my own imagination and my own curiosity and my own sort of my being itself is grounded not only in the ritual of writing, but also the ritual of reading and the ritual of taking these walks, which I've been taking daily for so many years I can't remember. And it's not always been by choice. I've been living without a car for a long time, and although I love to use a bicycle and I have used buses and I do enjoy using Uber, I find that my walks not only get me to where I need to go, given that I happen to live in a place where proximity allows this, but I've also come to find that walking on a daily basis, even without something to do, is fundamental to my own health, because it seems to allow for a lot of things, and you can tell that I'm hinting at a lot of things that I can't necessarily defend or explain. There's no scientific basis for this. I just know that I love it, and the best way I can explain it is that once you get into the habits of taking daily walks, and once you allow that sunlight and those infrared lights and whatever it is that comes through the sun, you'll find that it can actually animate parts of yourself where what you might experience is that the self that you thought you were, which is like the self that hasn't quite waken up, the self that is sort of in a sort of mood, you know what I mean? You might find that there are things like taking a walk where, lo and behold, without understanding, you'll suddenly discover yourself sort of reborn on a certain level. I'm advocating something that is relatively modest and relatively easy to do, but the benefits are not to be underestimated. Walking is also something that seems to be fundamental to what we are as a species. Oh, it's starting to rain. I love this. Hopefully it doesn't rain too much. But there is a sense in which walking is something that comes really natural to us, and it's no wonder that there are things like keeping a journal that are very common with people historically who have lived through lived lives that were creative and full and abundant. And so there's a sense in which, and I think I said running because I'm about to start running and I'm about to start allowing myself to include this interruption in my my recording. And thank God I didn't just hit that poor lady with her dog running also. I guess that's what happens when people are under stress or distressed, or people are overwhelmed by the toxicity of the moment, to use Heidegger's language. You know, thinking breaks down. Under pressure, we become bodies again, you know, for good or worse. And any illusions we have, for good or worse, are quickly saddled and put to the side, so that excuse me so that we can overcome. Because there's something within us, at the core of us, that pushes forward. In many ways, whatever this is, it gives order to what we do. And here I am speaking elliptically, because I'm also speaking just to speak, if you'll forgive me. But I'm also speaking as a way of recovering myself, in the sense that there's a language that has to keep going. And there's a sense in which, although it can be frustrating to like hear somebody talk a lot, especially somebody like me or somebody else, there is a sense in which sometimes one has to like let this language work itself out. And so there's a sense in which the rain has stopped now. I'm often like, I really enjoy it whenever people sort of cut me off while I'm talking. And a lot of people who are respectful, they'll apologize for this, but I think there's something natural to this. I think that, although I don't want to admit it in the moment, because there's often this rush that comes with thinking and articulation and explaining, it often is the proper moment. Because to what extent can you talk, or even write and write? You know, at what point do you like sort of begin listening? You know, and on a certain level, you can't listen until you exhaust yourself. So there's a sense in which so much writing and so much speaking and so much reading is largely, in many ways, it's an exercise or an exorcism, which involves exhausting that particular like side of our experience or of what we are, so that we might perhaps practice something else. I don't know. Maybe what needs to happen is that once we use our thinking in such a way that it helps us, what are we to do except stop thinking? I mean, and the same is true with feelings. What are we supposed to do with them? And I think on a certain level, walking and reading and speaking are not always necessarily about what they might sound like in themselves on the surface. There's often, as you all know, something else going on, and perhaps I have my own ideas as to what that something else is going on. But I think that there's something biological, that there's something physical perhaps, and there's something pivotal about using our bodies so that we can recover. If there is such a thing as primordial being, it must be in the senses, it must be in physical reality. And athleticism or art or conversation or reading, what are these in many ways but similar activities? I mean, in the sense that, you know, in the East, there's a word, you know, yana, and I'm certainly using the word wrong, but the word I could use is ladder or raft. And anyone that listens to like the work of Alan Watts is familiar with this theme. And it's a theme that I think we can build upon, because in Western languages, there's a phrase the famous scientist Richard Feynman used, which is heuristics, H-E-U-R-I-S-T-I-C-H, I think. And this means that oftentimes whenever we engage in thinking or playful activity, it's not necessarily just a way of accomplishing something or proving whether or not something is correct. Oftentimes what we're doing is exploring and playing. And you could say that walking is an activity akin to this, that once we've done what we're supposed to do in life, what are we supposed to do? Well, personally, I like to take a walk. I'm a simple person. I come from another time, as Norm Macdonald said, and my pleasures are relatively simple. I suspect that many people are taught to overcomplicate their desires insofar as it's possible to mistake your desires for something else. And of course, there's a degree of relativity in all this. Like, who am I to say what you should desire? But I do think that there's a sense in which our desires are often a little bit simpler than we make them out to be. And for myself, I know that that means that the things that I love to do are reading, contemplating, writing, and speaking. And these are things that don't have to be complicated. You don't have to make anything more out of them than what they are, because if they're meaningful to you, then they're meaningful in themselves. And so I suspect that there's a sense in which, what we're doing when we're walking is in many ways paying tribute to something that is ancient within us. And I know a little bit about the science behind it, and a little bit enough about walking to know that there is a point when we descended from the trees and stood up for the first time amidst the grasslands, the savanna, and began walking. And I think that there's a little connection between that and what happened to our brains. The most remarkable thing is what happened between 100,000 years ago and now, wherein our brains expanded so quickly that ultimately we're like our consciousness in itself is a kind of explosion in the larger framework of evolution. And I'm not a speciesist. I don't see the human species as being particularly unique, but I do think there's something to be said for us being sui generis, to use Latin phrase, meaning without category. And so I do think, however, there are some things that can be said, which is that whenever we walk, this activity seems to have some connection to our brains and to our health and to everything else. And the question that you always run into is like, why do this? And I have a little bit of experience selling fitness in a gym, in the sense that I was selling gym memberships. And so one effect of this is that I sort of taught myself to be able to list all the benefits of exercise and health and fitness. And so in a certain sense, it's never left me. And in many ways, I think that people significantly underestimate what they can do in the short term in terms of health and fitness and becoming a better kind of person. But they overestimate what they can do in the immediate, but they underestimate the effects of the long term and the effects of consistency. And the activity of taking a walk is the most important thing to me for reasons I don't understand even still, although I can list, benefits. I just know that I wake up and I have a taste for it, because there's a sense in which if you read a lot and write a lot, walking and even running and having conversations, all these things become especially meaningful in lieu of the fact that having exhausted one side of myself, I can then find so much pleasure in what those activities are not necessarily meeting. And there's something that I've been doing a long time along with walking, and that is recording myself talking while I walk. And in the same way that I've been writing for a long time, I've been doing it, quote unquote, for myself. And that might sound positive to a lot of people because we're taught that we should do things for ourselves. But in many ways, you're violating the artist's credo, which is that we make for other people. And so what's the point in spending all my time taking these delicious walks and recording my thoughts, because it's sort of knowing that you're being recorded sort of brings out a certain side of yourself where you take yourself more seriously than you normally do, and it sort of forces you to be more articulate and to examine yourself more closely than you normally would. And so there's a sense in which, why not simply begin recording what I do while talking about it, as a way of emphasizing how, as David Foster Wallace said, like, ordinary platitudes have a life or death consequence ultimately. And taking a walk, along with many other things, whatever they are, whatever works for you, these are all sort of rest. These are all sort of yanas. That's why I use that word. They're all sort of heuristics. That's why I use that word. As they are ways of reaching an end, but not an end in the sense that you keep walking when you get home or you keep reading when you stand up. You know, they're meaningful in themselves insofar as they lift you to a certain place. And so once I've taken my walk, I'm able to relax that side of myself, to relax that side of myself that's a lot like a dog that hasn't been let out. I mean, I think there's something in dogs that knows instinctively that they need to get out. And there's a part of me that has a connection with that isn't merely technical. It doesn't have to do with the health benefits. It has to do with the fact that it's great pleasure in itself. I mean, it's so much pleasure to take a walk. It's so much pleasure to have movement. And if you've ever been sick or ill, or you've experienced someone else who has been, in many ways you might see that happiness is rather simple, because happiness doesn't have to be made complicated, because happiness doesn't have to do with the presence of anything. It has to do with the absence. And so far as if you are relatively healthy and free, I'm not a Republican, but there's a sense in which there's no excuses for you not discovering happiness. And it is a process, but it's also a side effect of having, as I said, putting those two hands together to carry that fragile little egg, which is your consciousness, to where it needs to be. Because what we are, it doesn't happen by itself, you know, and the human mind isn't something that can exist in itself. In fact, the mind in itself is a question more than a fact, I would say. And the brain in itself thrives on this activity of motion, of being in motion. And so walking in many ways is like that. And in many ways, as I said, it's circular. It turns back in on itself. And in many ways, the mark of analogical thinking, the mark of like what is called irony, is that it turns in on itself. And so we don't walk in a straight line, we walk in a circle. We circle back in on itself. And so thinking to me isn't merely biologically related to the activity of speaking and walking. Thinking is related to the activity of turning within yourself. And that has to do with, you know, the idea that becoming another kind of person on a daily basis or within your life has to do with that turning, has to do with that that ability to take a walk or simply read, and to discover that you have become a little bit something else in the meantime, that you've twisted back into yourself a little. And so you find that in taking a walk, you come home and what you had been earlier is now augmented, in the same way that when you read a book or talk to a good friend, your experience is suddenly shaped in such a way because your attention is ultimately opened up to something more than itself. And you know, I've kind of come to find that I'm not sure we're supposed to spend so much time by ourselves, so much time living in these rooms like we do. There's a sense in which we need sleep and we need to recover, but there's a sense in which I heard once that the only kind of animal that spends as much time inside as we do is a wounded animal. And I suppose if you're traumatized or you're dealing with those kind of issues, then the best thing you can do is to go into full recovery, whatever that means. And as Pascal said, learn how to sit quietly alone in a room. However, it could be that what you really need is to get out and discover that the world isn't what you thought it was, and it's not what you think it is. In fact, it's something that is much more than you, and it is you. And yet the only way in which you can understand this is by moving through it. And so when you take a walk, you sort of allow yourself this important little skeleton key in terms of feeling more relaxed, because when you're more relaxed you can think more freely. And so if there's any like discipline to learn, it's the discipline of taking a walk. And this is the first in many videos I'm going to make on walking, because the next thing I could talk about is how there hasn't been anything I haven't ever been able to just simply walk away from. This is Middle Child signing out.